Hey there, welcome to your next math lesson, lesson 1.2. And today's I can statement, I can generate equivalent fractions. Make sure you write that into your notebook. And just like yesterday, if anything's confusing or you need to jot some extra notes to help yourself as you go back and work through some of the stuff in class, I encourage you to pause the video and do that. You can also rewatch this video anytime you want to give yourself another go at it if any of this stuff is confusing for you. So, an equivalent fractions are fractions that represent the same value. In other words, they're equal to each other. So we're going to start off with some relatively straightforward ones that we've done before. So let's start with 1/2. Let's look at the fraction bar below it that's divided into sixths. How many sixths does it take to make 1/2? Think about that for a second. Got it? Takes 3 of them. Circle 3 of them, that equals half. So 3/6 is equivalent or equal to 1/2. Let's look at the next fraction bar. It's divided into eighths. How many eighths do you need to make 1/2? 4. So 4/8 is also equivalent or equal to 1/2. Now you will also hear me refer to occasionally the n split. N just stands for number. It's the number of times that we split the fraction. Okay, so if you're looking at this first fraction here, we 3 split 1/2 to make 3/6. What that means is we took 1/2 and we divided it into 3 equal parts, and that made 3/6. Down here, we 4 split 1/2 to make 4/8. So we divided that 1/2 into 4 equal parts, and that became 1/8. Now, let's talk about using multiplication to generate equivalent fractions. Again, this should be reviewed from last year, but let's take a look at this first fraction down here. We've got 3/6 equals 1/2. How do I make 1/2 into 3/6? Well, how do I make 1 into 3 or 2 into 6? What do I have to multiply by? I have to multiply by 3. Okay, so 1 times 3 is 3. And 2 times 3 is 6. So that's how we get that 3/6. We just use multiplication, and it will work every time when you're making equivalent fractions as long as you multiply the numerator and denominator by exactly the same number. I cannot overemphasize that. You can't multiply the top by one number and the bottom by another, or you're not going to end up with an equivalent fraction. Okay? Our next part down there, how do we make 1/2 into 4/8? Well, how do I make 1 into 4 or 2 into 8? What do I have to multiply by? I have to multiply by 4. 1 times 4 and 2 times 4, which is going to give me 4/8. Remember we talked about that 4 split, right? On the previous page and the 3 split? Well, look what happens. When we multiply times that 3 split, that's where we get that 3/6. The 3 and 4 are back here again. Now, multiplication is not the only way that we can generate equivalent fractions. We can also use division to generate equivalent fractions. Okay? There's a couple things to remember. When dividing fractions, but you must divide both the numerator and denominator by the same factor. You can't, again, you have to, just like in multiplication, you can't use different numbers top and bottom or it will not work. Okay? The number you choose to divide by must be a factor of both the numerator and denominator. Okay? You can't just have a factor of one. It's got to fit into both of those numbers. So let's take a look at this fraction here. I've got 8/12. Now what can I divide 8/12 by? And some of you might have a number in your mind already. What's a factor of both 8 and 12? Well, I'm going to pick the easy one because it's an even number. I know it can be divided by 2. So I'm going to divide the top and bottom by 2. When I do that, that's going to give me 6 on the bottom because 12 divided by 2 is 6 and 8 divided by 2 is 4. So 4/6 is equivalent or equal to 8/12. Now we're going to talk about simplest form. Okay? When a fraction is in simplest form, it means that there is no whole number other than 1 that divides evenly into the numerator and denominator. So what does that mean? It means that when I'm going to reduce my fraction, it means the only factor that fits into both those numbers, if the fraction is in as low as it can go or in simplest form, the only factor those two numbers will share will be 1. So, let's take a look at the first one I did on the other page, 8/12. When I divided this by 2, it gave me an equivalent fraction, but that fraction is not in simplest form because these two still share a factor that's a number that's different than 1. So think about what factor do these two numbers still share? What could I divide both of these numbers by that would be the same number? Okay, well that would be 2. So if I divide that by 2, it equals 2/3. Now we are in simplest form. Because 2 and 3, the only factor they share in common is 1, and that's it. There's nothing else. Some of you may have caught this right away when you looked at it. Maybe you thought of 4 right away. If I would have divided 8 and 12 by 4, I would have come up with 2/3 down here. Another way to reduce to simplest form is to think, what is the largest common factor these numbers share? So looking at 21 and 24, what is the biggest factor that they share in common? I want you to pause that a minute and think about it. I'm going to go over the answer right now. So, the biggest number that they share in common is 3. So if I divide the numerator and denominator by their largest common factor, that's going to give me 7/8. And I'm going to talk about ways to figure out what that is in some upcoming lessons as well. Alright, so here are your practice problems for today. There's 3 of them. I want you to use multiplication to generate one equivalent fraction for the fraction below for the first one. And you're going to have a variety of answers. You don't have to have the same answer as your neighbor or partner as long as it's equivalent to 1/3. Use division to generate one equivalent fraction for the fraction below. And the last one is I want you to write that fraction in simplest form. If you have questions, write them down. We'll go over them together when we meet in our groups tomorrow. Have a great night.